Alright, so here we are, 25th of April. Let me turn around. 2014. Commemorating the writing from 10 years ago today. Once again, this writing did not appear in the final copy of Being and Learning. I don't know why, it just didn't do it. It just didn't make it in, as I've been commenting the last couple of days. So on the 26th of April, which is tomorrow, half of that work made it in, and it's the beginning of the chapter on Heraclitus. So this is the last full absent meditation. So I'll go ahead and read it. Again, this is material that is finally concluding the reading of Plato's allegory, The Cave. And lest I forget, I just finished a paper, which is kind of like an important move for me anyway, that I'll be publishing in Lapiz, which is the journal of the Latin American Philosophy Education Society, as well as, and I'll be presenting it on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. That paper has me thinking about this hemisphere. It has me thinking about Incan fundamental ontology that's coming from the Incan reality. And in just doing preliminary research, anticipating where I'm going, I've been focusing a bit on the sort of Andean cosmology and Andean fundamental ontology that arises and is, presented in their construction of certain sites, places. And one of the things that's already struck me is that they identify caves, and they use caves as part of the documentation of their cosmology, so that the fundamental ontology, if we want to understand it, we have to think about the purpose of caves and how they're used to understand the relationship between the Incans, their understanding of themselves in relationship to the world. And so I thought that was very appropriate and very well connected to this part of the writing on the allegory of the cave. The concluding moments of the allegory make it clear that those who speak with ridicule and rage are not prepared to undertake the ascent, are not able to hear the news, receive the glad tidings, and join in the creation of the community. We can safely surmise the conclusion of the allegory is an allusion to the fate of Socrates, who was tried and executed by the Athenians in 399 BC. on what seems to be the bogus charges of crimes against the state. Quote, if they could lay hands on the man who was trying to set them free and lead them up, they would kill him. Unquote. The state that indicted and found him guilty was actually a slim majority of citizens, a little over half of the Athenian stakeholders who attended the trial. We will never know for certain how many citizens were in agreement with the verdict, nor the fallout from the execution. There is certainly nothing in Plato that we might turn to aside from the important fact that Socrates lived on in Plato's dialogues and then achieved an immortality that few philosophers have ever achieved. His immortality overshadows the details of the fallout, and it indicates that Socrates' hope to be among those present at the hero's banquet was fulfilled. However, it is possible for us to see the formalization of philosophy by Plato and Aristotle as one of the most important outcomes of Socrates' execution. The creation of the Academy by Plato and its expansion under Aristotle suggests that the philosophy of the marketplace, the public philosophy of by and for the people, was doomed to become a practice excluded behind protected walls. Socrates' execution represented the death of a kind of philosophical practice that followed from the obvious tension that emerges when we think through the implications regarding the readiness and preparation of students to receive the evocative saying and make the arduous transition from education to learning. But when we ask the question, but who will hear the one who returns, we, along with Plato, make two competing, if not contrasting, presumptions. On the one hand, as he says through the voice of Socrates when offering a reflection on the allegory, quote, we must conclude that education is not what is said by some who profess to put knowledge into the soul, which does not possess it, as if they could put sight into blind eyes. On the contrary, our own account signifies that the soul of every man does possess the power of learning, the truth, and the organ to see it with. Republic 5:18. Complementing and completing the turning around that liberates his power, this natural-born capacity is, quote, an art whose aim would be to effect this very thing, the conversion of the soul in the readiest way, not to put the power of sight into the soul's eyes, which already has it, but to ensure that instead of looking in the wrong direction, it is turned the way it ought to be, unquote. However, this natural-born capacity, along with the art that both prepares and liberates it, cannot guarantee that each and every one will in fact be prepared properly and respond when they are called. Those in the cave who ridicule their damaged friend, or who would want to kill the guide who is responsible for taking him through the transformative experience, represent a type who are not ready nor willing to receive the tidings to get learning underway. They are contrasted with the sensible man who responds with questions rather than derision. The one who is prepared is thus one who recognizes the transformation as a transformation, not a corruption. Quote, instead of laughing thoughtlessly, he will ask whether, coming from a brighter existence, the liberated one's unaccustomed vision is obscured by the darkness, in which case he will think its condition enviable and its life a happy one. The emergence of these two modalities compete and even conflict with the presumption that all are capable of being turned around and put underway. Plato resolved this by way of induction. The existence of citizens who are capable of hearing Socrates and engaging him in dialogue implied the existence of noble natures who should, quote, be made to climb the ascent to the vision of the goodness, and when they have looked upon it long enough, they must not be allowed, as they now are, to remain on the heights, refusing to come down again to the prisoners or to take part in any of their labors and reward, however much or little these may be worth. Republic 5:19. If we follow Plato's path, then we too will arrive at the conclusion that those who appear most capable, that is, ready and willing to learn, to participate in poetic dialogue, the reciprocal exchange of evocative speech, should be compelled to go down again to the cave. But this implies a kind of circle whereby those who are prepared to learn are also those who are prepared to teach, or prepared to learn the art of teaching. Hence, to be an apprentice of learning is to be an apprentice in the art of teaching. But what of those who appear deaf to the call of the other? What is to be made of their undeveloped capacity to receive the gift of teachability, to be drawn out into learning? That's how it ends. So it's kind of a weird way that it ends, insofar as I feel the need to ask about those others. Quite frankly, at this moment, feeling somewhat exhausted from writing this paper and finishing this paper, and also at the end of this academic year, I feel less generous and less inclined to ask that question, in part because I'm just sort of exhausted by the resistance. I mean, when I wrote this 10 years ago, there was so much resistance to anything that was outside of what they call the outcomes-based assessment, right? Anything that couldn't be measured, that couldn't be quantified, that couldn't be digitized, I suppose, to some extent, although this is being digitized, so I have to be careful. anything that couldn't be tested and quantified and, you know, produce data, numbers that could then be mined, was thought to be out of bounds and just not, because it wasn't quantifiable. It wasn't, you know, so the liberal arts seemed pretty much doomed, or they would have to be placed within this regime of assessment, this metrics regime. So that was 10 years ago. It's gotten worse. At that time, I remember thinking, well, as I taught my students, who were mostly, you know, people working in schools, that it's unfortunate that you're in the situation. I'm very fortunate that I'm not. Well, we are now, for sure. I mean, that regime, that assessment regime, just has made its way all the way up to the university. And by up, I just mean in terms of the grades. When we think of people growing, getting taller, bigger as they get older, and in terms of the, you know, the size of the people. You know, my son's 4. He'd barely be. He's about that big. My daughters are 18 and 20, and they're, well, almost 18 and 20, and they're up here. So that's what I mean by that, in terms of the growth, not hierarchy. So anyway, in the university, we're increasingly under that, and such that, you know, I don't really much care about those who, I mean, I do insofar as, if you take seriously what Plato is saying, and that's the spirit of the question, if everyone has the capacity to do philosophy, to think philosophically, then what about those who don't hear the call to do it? But, you know, there's a kind of a straightforward answer, which is the one that's, well, it's because what they're hearing and what they're buying into is something that's not philosophical. It's a tautological. It's a very straightforward way of you know, responding to the question. It's not to make a judgment about them as not capable. They're just not interested, and they benefited on a number of measures by not being interested in it. So, you know, I don't know if that's cynical. I suppose it is cynical, but why? I guess what my point is, I'm not going to invest energy in having a concern towards those who have chosen not to take up their capacity to think philosophically. There's no point in that. I'm much more interested in those who are, and I'm excited and energized by those who are, like I am with my students that find their way mostly by requirement into my courses in philosophy of education. And in those cases, now that they're a captured audience, I, you know, sort of draw them into, and then, but it just seems like it's not that hard to do. You know, that is to say, they seem to be willing participants in the process. Now, of course, one can take this attitude that it doesn't concern one and that it doesn't matter, and then all of a sudden the courses aren't there to teach, and so now what do you do? You know, so, you know, I mean, I say that in part because at this time of year where the semester is winding down, I'm just looking forward to not having to take up those questions. So, at any rate, that's where I'm going to leave it on this 25th day, where I've submitted a paper that I'm fairly excited about, and continuing to do this work and seeing these two things overlapping.